Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on January 19, 2012. The filing was not a surprise to anyone who had been following the company's financial deterioration across the preceding decade, but it was a shock in the way that the confirmation of a long-anticipated catastrophe is always a shock. The moment when an institution that has been a fixed feature of a city's identity for more than a century is formally declared to have failed produces a specific kind of grief that financial analysis cannot adequately describe. Rochester, New York had been a Kodak Company town for longer than most American cities have existed as coherent economic communities. George Eastman had founded the company in Rochester in 1881. By the middle of the 20th century, Kodak employed approximately 60,000 people in Rochester, representing at various points between a quarter and a third of the city's entire workforce. The company had built employee housing, funded civic institutions, endowed the University of Rochester, constructed a performing arts center, and created a physical and social infrastructure for the city that made the distinction between the Kodak Company and the Rochester community functionally meaningless in the daily lives of the people who inhabited both. The Kodak headquarters complex on State Street in Rochester was not merely a corporate office building. It was the institutional center of a company town, the physical address from which one of the most consequential American corporations of the 20th century had directed operations that had touched every photographed moment in American domestic life, since the Brownie camera made photography accessible to anyone who could load a roll of film. The forensic entry point for this case is the relationship between technological innovation and institutional self-destruction, because Kodak documents with precision the proposition that a company can invent the technology that eventually makes it obsolete, understand that it has done so, fail to act on that understanding at the scale required to prevent the obsolescence, and then file for bankruptcy in the headquarters building whose construction had expressed the certainty that no such outcome was possible. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. Eastman Kodak's Internal Research and Development Division invented the digital camera in 1975. The inventor was Stephen Sasson, a Kodak engineer whose prototype used a charge-coupled device sensor to capture images electronically and store them on a digital cassette tape. The image resolution was low, the capture time was long, and the device weighed 8 pounds. Sasson demonstrated the prototype to Kodak management. The response from Kodak management was not enthusiastic endorsement of a technology that would transform photography. It was a request to keep the development quiet, because the technology that Sasson had invented would, if commercialized, undermine the film and chemical processing business that generated the overwhelming majority of Kodak's revenue and profit. The covenant that Kodak's management did not read carefully enough was written not in any loan document or regulatory filing, but in the mathematics of technological adoption, the rate at which digital imaging would improve in resolution, decrease in cost, and increase in convenience relative to film photography was a function of semiconductor physics and manufacturing economics, not of Kodak's product development choices. Kodak could delay its own commercialization of digital photography. It could not delay the commercialization of digital photography by Sony, Canon, Nikon, and the consumer electronics manufacturers who would eventually make film photography obsolete. Regardless of what Kodak chose to do, the decision to suppress and delay the digital camera technology was not irrational from the perspective of a management team whose quarterly earnings and annual bonuses were tied to the performance of the film and chemical processing business. It was catastrophic from the perspective of an institution whose long-term survival required either leading the digital transition or finding a new business model before the transition made the old one irrelevant. Kodak eventually entered the digital camera market in the early 1990s and invested significantly in digital imaging technology. Across the decade that followed, the investment was too late, too fragmented, and too constrained by the organizational and financial commitments that the film business required to produce a competitive digital imaging business capable of replacing the revenue that film's decline eliminated. At what point does a company's protection of an existing business model become an act of institutional self-destruction rather than responsible asset management? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology that governed Kodak's strategic planning across the 2 decades between the digital camera's invention in 1975 and the company's first serious digital imaging investments in the mid-1990s shared the foundational error documented across this channel's archive, but expressed it through a mechanism that previous case files have not examined: the treatment of an existing technology monopoly as a durable baseline for long-term strategic planning, rather than as a cyclical competitive position whose disruption was both inevitable and mathematically predictable. Kodak's film and chemical processing business had generated returns that no subsequent business the company entered could approach, because the film business was structurally exceptional. It combined consumable product economics, where every roll of film taken and processed generated recurring revenue, with network effects from the global distribution and processing infrastructure that Kodak had built over a century. That business had been generating margins that strategic planners had treated as permanent features of the company's competitive position, rather than as a specific historical circumstance enabled by a technological paradigm whose replacement was already underway in Kodak's own laboratories. The digital imaging transition did not merely reduce Kodak's revenue. It eliminated the consumable product economics that had made the film business exceptional, because digital photography requires no film and no chemical processing. After the initial hardware purchase, the replacement of a recurring revenue stream with a one-time hardware sale is not a revenue reduction. It is a business model destruction. Kodak's strategic planning across the 1980s and early 1990s treated the digital transition as a revenue reduction that could be managed through cost-cutting and digital investment, rather than as a business model destruction that required a fundamental reimagination of what Kodak was and what it would sell. The Rochester headquarters complex, whose construction and maintenance had expressed the assumption that the film business would generate the revenue to support it indefinitely, became a fixed cost that the declining film revenue and the insufficient digital revenue were progressively less able to carry. The building outlasted the business model. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. Rochester, New York's relationship with Eastman Kodak's decline is the most precisely documented example in American urban history of what happens to a company town when the company fails. The 60,000 Kodak employees of mid-century Rochester had declined to approximately 13,000 by the time of the 2012 bankruptcy filing, a reduction that had occurred progressively across 2 decades of restructuring, layoffs, and the systematic dismantling of the employment infrastructure that had made Kodak synonymous with Rochester's economic identity. Each restructuring had produced a specific community response: the closure of facilities, the departure of employees, the reduction in the civic funding that Kodak had historically provided, and the incremental withdrawal of the institutional presence that had been so total that its absence was experienced not merely as economic loss, but as a change in the fundamental character of the city. The denial architecture in this case is distributed across 3 distinct institutional actors. Kodak's management denied, across 2 decades of digital transition, that the company's strategic response was inadequate to the speed and scale of the disruption it faced. Rochester's political and civic leadership denied, across the same period, that the city's dependence on a single employer had created a structural vulnerability that no amount of economic development effort could address as quickly as the disruption was producing its consequences. And the broader American corporate and financial community denied, by continuing to value Kodak stock and extend its credit through the late 1990s and 2000s on the basis of the company's patent portfolio and its residual film business, that the business model destruction that the digital transition had produced was as complete and as irreversible as the revenue data had been documenting for years. The patent portfolio that the bankruptcy estate would eventually monetize was real and produced substantial recoveries for creditors. It was not a business. It was the intellectual inheritance of a business that had made the strategic choices that the architecture of its company town headquarters had been designed to foreclose as possibilities. The Eastman Kodak headquarters complex in Rochester, New York has been partially repurposed and partially redeveloped in the years following the 2012 bankruptcy, a process that the Rochester community has managed with the combination of civic determination and economic constraint that characterizes the redevelopment of company town industrial infrastructure in post-industrial American cities. The Kodak Tower, the iconic 19-story headquarters building at 343 State Street, whose silhouette defined Rochester's downtown skyline for decades, remains standing. Various portions of the broader Kodak campus have been redeveloped for educational, medical, and mixed-use purposes through the investments of the Rochester community and the entities that acquired the former Kodak properties out of the bankruptcy estate. The University of Rochester, which Kodak had endowed and which Kodak employees had supported through generations of giving, remains one of the country's leading research universities. The Eastman Theater, which George Eastman had built as a gift to Rochester's cultural life, continues to operate. What the Kodak case reveals in the context of this channel's 39 case archive is the specific category of institutional failure that technological self-disruption represents. A category that this channel has not previously documented because every previous case file has examined a financial structure that failed to support an asset whose fundamental competitive position was either stable or declining for conventional market reasons. Kodak documents a company that was the dominant force in a market it was simultaneously making obsolete, that understood it was doing so, and that made the specific choice to prioritize the preservation of the existing business model over the investments required to lead the transition that would eventually eliminate it. The camera that made Rochester wealthy was invented in Rochester. The camera that made Rochester's largest employer bankrupt was also invented in Rochester. The Kodak Tower is still there on State Street, looking down over a city that is still processing what the company's failure means for its identity and its future. George Eastman gave Rochester a world-class university, a performing arts center, and a century of prosperity built on the chemistry of light and silver halide, and the specific human desire to preserve moments in permanent form. His company invented the device that made all of that unnecessary. The building is still there. The film is gone. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between technological innovation and institutional self-preservation in American corporate history, subscribe because the next case examines a company that faced a similar technological disruption and made a different set of choices with a different outcome. And in the comments, given Kodak's documented invention of the digital camera in 1975 and its subsequent strategic suppression of that technology, what specific corporate governance mechanism would have forced a more aggressive digital transition before the film business's decline made adequate investment impossible? The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.